welcome to the Deep Dive. We have an incredibly dense, highly provocative journey ahead of us today.
We really do.
Yeah, mapping out some truly paradigm-shifting source material. But right at the top, before we even crack the spine on this one, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show.
It really is the single best way to ensure you never miss out on these comprehensive explorations.
Exactly. It genuinely helps us keep bringing this level of analysis directly to you. So, today's deep dive is a full, unfiltered, and comprehensive review of a newly released 2025 ebook by Conrad Riker.
And the title itself is, it's a lot to take in.
It's a mouthful.
Right. The title is The Great Feminization Wokeness, an epiphenomenon of female supremacy, capture of institutions, and Marxist satanic inversions of merit to DEI.
If you want to follow along with us as we break this all down, or if you want to dig into the raw source material yourself, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
Highly recommend having it open if you want to see the raw data we're talking about.
And to keep up with the author's ongoing work, make sure you follow him at Conrad Riker on Substack.
So that title alone is a dense piece of architecture.
It really sets the stage.
It does. And before we even look at the specific claims, I think it's worth defining a key term Riker uses right there on the cover: epiphenomenon.
Yeah, let's unpack that for a second.
In philosophy and science, an epiphenomenon is essentially a secondary effect. It's a byproduct that arises from, but doesn't actually fundamentally cause, a primary phenomenon.
Okay, so it's the symptom, not the disease.
Exactly. By using that specific word, Riker is immediately laying down his core thesis. He's arguing that the modern cultural movement we broadly categorize as wokeness is not the main event.
It's not the root cause.
Right. It isn't the root cause of the societal shift. He claims it's merely the inevitable byproduct, the resulting symptom of a much deeper, more fundamental structural reality, which he defines as the demographic capture of our institutions by a female-coded value system.
And that distinction is crucial for setting the mission of today's deep dive. If you're a listener who's engaged with the manosphere, or if you follow men's rights activism, or if you evaluate culture from a red-pilled perspective, this book is explicitly engineered and framed as an absolute must-read for you.
It's a very systematic attempt to map out exactly how historically rigorous, merit-based, and inherently adversarial institutions were captured.
The institutions that defined Western civilization before they were radically altered.
Right. And Riker argues this wasn't done through some loud, violent revolution. It was done through a silent demographic shift.
He posits that the decay of these foundational institutions isn't the result of some shadowy, cigar smoke-filled Marxist conspiracy operating in secret.
No, instead, his framework suggests it's a psychological regime rooted deeply in maternal archetypes, where empathy has essentially been weaponized into a form of administrative tyranny.
Which ultimately leads to the systematic erasure of male identity.
Which brings us to a really mandatory and essential disclaimer regarding our role in this discussion today.
Always important to state.
Absolutely. The claims Riker makes in this book are highly charged. They are deeply controversial. And they touch upon the absolute most sensitive sociological and political fault lines of our modern era.
So our mission in this deep dive is to impartially unpack those meticulous, detailed claims.
We are acting strictly as neutral guides through the architecture of his argument.
Right. We are not endorsing the political, social, or cultural viewpoints presented in this text.
Nor are we attempting to validate or debunk them. Our sole job is to objectively lay out Riker's fascinating worldview.
To present the specific data, the studies, and the anecdotes he uses to build his case so that you, the listener, can fully comprehend the foundation of his thesis and evaluate it for yourself.
We are essentially the cartographers reading the map he's drawn.
I like that analogy. So, part one of his map begins with a concept he titles The Silent Shift and the Death of Adversarial Culture.
And to build this foundation, Riker doesn't start with philosophy. He starts with hard demographic data.
Specifically, he looks at the conquest of media and academia. He cites a 2023 study by Pew Research.
And this data point is wild.
It really is. It demonstrates that 78% of all U.S. newsroom employees are now women.
78%.
And to provide some historical context, he notes that in 1985, that number was 32%.
So roughly 8 out of every 10 journalists, editors, and producers shaping our daily informational reality are female.
And Riker explicitly rejects the corporate framing of this shift as diversity. In his lexicon, this is demographic conquest.
But the demographic data is just his starting point. Where his analysis deepens is in his exploration of how a 78% demographic majority fundamentally alters the actual product being manufactured by that institution.
He makes the case that when a newsroom undergoes this level of demographic capture, the output morphs from rigorous adversarial journalism into what he provocatively terms emotional daycare.
Emotional daycare. To substantiate this, he leans on a recent Harvard study analyzing media output based on newsroom demographics.
Right. And the findings show that newsrooms with over a 60% female staff produce 33% fewer investigative reports.
Which is a huge drop.
It is. And concurrently, those same newsrooms produce 55% more lived experience or first-person emotional essays.
So Riker uses this to argue that the underlying metric for professional success in these environments has shifted away from objective truth-seeking or holding power accountable,
Moving entirely toward emotional resonance and the validation of subjective feelings.
to make that statistical shift concrete. He provides some highly specific examples from major media organizations.
Yeah, let's look at the BuzzFeed News example he gives.
He notes that internal editorial guidelines actively banned reporters from using the traditional journalistic framing of he said, she said.
And the rationale provided by the organization was that framing a story as a conflict between two opposing viewpoints presented that conflict as neutral, which they deemed harmful.
Right. Instead, reporters were instructed to utilize consensus circles and empathy statements to resolve narrative disputes.
He then points to NPR. He details an incident where a seasoned reporter was formally reprimanded by Human Resources simply for using the word alleged when covering the corruption trial of a politician.
The HR department's justification was that utilizing the legally accurate term alleged somehow re-traumatized victims of systemic doubt.
The implications of those examples are central to Riker's overarching thesis. He's suggesting that the maternal archetype,
Which evolutionary psychology tells us is driven by the instinct to soothe, to mitigate risk, to avoid direct conflict.
exactly, and to prioritize emotional comfort above all else. He's saying that this archetype has completely overridden the traditional journalistic mandate.
He even points to internal memos at CNN where anchors were explicitly instructed to avoid utilizing sharp tones or aggressive language, even when conducting interviews with authoritarian leaders known for human rights abuses.
Which is crazy when you think about it. According to Riker's framework, you cannot rigorously interrogate a hostile foreign dictator if your primary cognitive load is dedicated to worrying about your tone sounding harsh or unwelcoming.
This, he posits, represents the absolute death of adversarial culture in the media. Truth is no longer forged in the fire of debate. It's massaged into existence through emotional consensus.
And he argues this exact same psychological phenomenon has entirely captured the university system, transforming higher education into what he calls the academic nursery.
The academic nursery, it paints a very specific picture.
It does. And he backs it up by looking at the environment of modern higher education. He references an extensive survey conducted by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, commonly known as FIRE.
And the data there shows a staggering 78% of college faculty across the United States admit to regularly self-censoring their lectures and publications.
78%.
Yeah.
And the vital context Riker adds here is the reason for the censorship.
Right, they aren't self-censoring out of a fear of physical violence or government imprisonment, which were the historical drivers of academic suppression.
Instead, they're terrified of internal HR complaints generated by students claiming that a misplaced historical fact or a challenging philosophical premise caused them emotional harm.
He contextualizes this fear alongside the current university demographics, where women now earn 60% of all U.S. college degrees.
For Riker, the classical Socratic method,
The relentless pursuit of truth through direct, often uncomfortable intellectual conflict.
exactly, that method has been functionally eradicated on these campuses, replaced entirely by a systemic demand for emotional safety.
Riker constructs a litany of institutional anecdotes to illustrate how this decay operates on a daily basis.
His overarching argument is that universities have fundamentally altered their manufacturing process. They've ceased producing critical thinkers and have systematically begun producing professional victims.
He highlights the infamous incident at Yale University. A distinguished professor and her husband, who served as heads of a residential college, were ultimately forced out of their position.
And their offense was not a failure of academic rigor.
No, it was sending an email mildly suggesting that adult college students should be capable of choosing their own Halloween costumes without administrative oversight dictating what was culturally offensive.
Riker emphasizes the reaction. It was not a scheduled debate in a lecture hall. The response was a screaming, sobbing mob of students physically surrounding the professor, demanding apologies and resignations because the email made them feel unsafe.
He goes further into the curriculum itself to show how deeply this philosophy has penetrated.
He details a case involving a male undergraduate student at Reed College. This student was formally expelled from the university following a debate concerning gender dynamics.
The Honor Board's official ruling stated that by citing the classical philosopher Aristotle to build his argument, the student had imposed patriarchal logic on inclusive discourse.
Aristotle, fundamentally the father of Western logic and categorical reasoning,
Was essentially deemed contraband for being too rigid and logical.
Riker follows this with an example from Sarah Lawrence College, where a literature syllabus explicitly banned the reading of Friedrich Nietzsche.
The stated reason was that Nietzsche's philosophy discouraged vulnerability and promoted an overly aggressive individualism.
Riker poses a rhetorical question to you, the reader. What is the fate of a civilization that bans Nietzsche for the crime of being too strong?
He rounds out this section with a look at the current administrative leniency. He cites a documented instance at UC Berkeley where a student posted a video of herself crying on TikTok about the general pressure of academic deadlines.
And without requiring any medical documentation or verifiable hardship, the university administration granted her sweeping paper extensions, treating her broadcasted tears as a legitimate institutional currency.
These examples force a critical evaluation of Riker's core question. What are the long-term consequences for a complex civilization when its premier sense-making institutions actively replace objective reality with subjective emotion?
Riker's answer to this question serves as the bridge into part 2 of his outline. He moves from the broad demographic capture to the specific mechanics of how this power is maintained.
Exploring how language itself has been weaponized into a tool of suppression, he categorizes this framework as the language of soft power and the gossip grid.
This transition into the mechanics of language is where Riker's systemic critique becomes incredibly granular. He introduces a concept he calls emotion as epistemology.
For those unfamiliar with the philosophical term, epistemology is simply the study of how we know, what constitutes valid truth and knowledge.
Riker is arguing that within these captured institutions, the epistemological standard has flipped. Feelings no longer just react to facts. Feelings are facts.
Subjective emotional states have been elevated to the status of objective truth.
Consequently, language within corporate and academic environments is heavily policed, not to maintain a standard of polite civility, but as a mechanism for absolute behavioral control.
To anchor this claim in reality, he brings forward a highly revealing internal memo leaked from Facebook in 2019.
And this leaked Facebook memo serves as a primary pillar for his argument regarding the modern workplace.
According to the document, during internal performance reviews, the nebulous term aggressive tone was cited as the primary and often the only reason male engineers faced disciplinary action or were denied promotions.
Crucially, Riker contrasts this with the treatment of female employees within the exact same review structures.
Right, women who exhibited highly emotionally charged outbursts or who utilized accusatory, emotionally manipulative language during team meetings were not penalized.
In fact, the memo revealed they were frequently praised by management for demonstrating authentic communication and vulnerability.
Riker uses this stark disparity to connect modern corporate culture directly to evolutionary psychology. He leans heavily on the extensive research of British anthropologist Robin Dunbar.
Dunbar's work studies the evolution of human social networks.
It indicates that while men evolved to utilize direct, physical, or overt confrontation to resolve disputes and establish hierarchy, women evolved a completely different mechanism.
To mitigate the profound physical risks associated with direct conflict, women developed sophisticated systems of indirect aggression.
Tactics centered around gossip, social exclusion, reputation destruction, and the manipulation of group consensus.
By applying Dunbar's anthropological research to the modern office, Riker is essentially stating that the 21st century corporate workplace has been entirely restructured into a laboratory for female social strategy.
Men who operate using their biological and historical baseline,
being direct, blunt, and overtly competitive,
are immediately flagged by human resources as toxic, aggressive, or unsafe.
Meanwhile, women are institutionally rewarded for utilizing emotional volatility and indirect maneuvering. Riker maps out exactly how this indirect aggression functions as an institutional immune system.
Designed to target and eliminate threats to the emotional consensus. He formalizes this process into an acronym he calls GSR, gossip, shame, rally.
The GSR mechanism is arguably the most vital operational concept in Riker's entire sociological framework.
It provides a step-by-step description of how heavily female-dominated environments naturally identify a dissenting male and systematically neutralize him.
Typically, Riker notes, the target is a highly competent, high-performing male who relies on logic, data, and directness, rather than prioritizing the emotional consensus of the group.
The process initiates with gossip. Informal, untraceable back-channeling about the individual's vibes or his lack of emotional intelligence.
Once the groundwork is laid, it escalates to public shame, often taking the form of call-outs in meetings or passive-aggressive company-wide emails.
Finally, it culminates in the rally, where the group collectively generates a wave of formal HR complaints, overwhelming the individual with a manufactured consensus of harm.
Riker points out that this is not merely playground behavior bleeding into the adult world. It has been formalized and validated as official corporate policy.
To demonstrate this, he cites a rigorous investigation by the Wall Street Journal. It found that a staggering 44% of female human resources professionals openly admitted to utilizing tears.
Specifically starting to cry during a negotiation or dispute.
Yes, as a deliberate tactic to end debates they were losing on logical grounds.
Riker refers to this as the crying defense. In this new paradigm, empathy is no longer defined as the mutual cognitive understanding of another person's perspective.
It's been weaponized into a tactical maneuver deployed specifically to silence intellectual dissent.
The specific case studies Riker provides to illustrate this sisterhood sanction, as he calls it, are incredibly revealing for anyone currently trying to navigate the modern corporate landscape.
He details the trajectory of a high-level male executive at Spotify.
Right, during a strategic planning meeting, this executive disagreed with a new company proposal. He built his counter-argument entirely on user data, market projections, and financial metrics.
He did not utilize insults or personal attacks.
However, because his disagreement challenged the consensus, he was subsequently subjected to a mandatory internal listening session.
During this session, female employees were given a platform to publicly shame him, stating that his reliance on raw data demonstrated a lack of empathy and made them feel unseen.
Faced with this orchestrated GSR campaign, he was forced to resign within 48 hours.
Another example involves a senior engineer at Pinterest. This employee simply updated his internal corporate profile photo to a picture of himself hiking in the woods.
Shortly after, HR began quietly building a case to push him out.
The reasoning, driven by an internal DEI committee, was that he didn't smile enough during virtual meetings, and his solitary hiking photo gave off unapproachable vibes that disrupted the team's emotional synergy.
Riker even points to the discovery of leaked internal Slack channels at major tech firms, literally titled #SisterhoodWatch.
In these channels, female employees systematically tracked, logged, and amplified the perceived microaggressions of their male coworkers.
Documenting offenses as minor as a man, using the generic phrase, "Hey guys," to address a project team in an email.
What Riker is eliminating with these examples is a profound structural shift in organizational power dynamics. He extends this analysis to the broader cultural reckoning of recent years.
He argues that the Me Too movement, while undeniably originating as a necessary mechanism to expose and remove genuine horrific predators from positions of power, was rapidly co-opted.
In Riker's view, it was absorbed into this pre-existing mass-scale GSR network.
The result was an environment where the mere accusation was functionally equated with guilt, and the highly subjective, unquantifiable feeling of being unsafe around a male colleague was treated with the exact same institutional severity as an objective, verifiable HR violation.
This analysis of corporate behavior perfectly bridges into part 3 of his book, where he zooms out to examine the actual administrative apparatus enforcing these rules.
Dedicating an entire section to what he terms the bureaucratic matriarchy and the DEI industrial complex.
Let's delve into that administrative apparatus because, according to Riker, the Human Resources Department is the primary battlefield where this institutional capture was solidified.
He begins by looking at the demographic makeup of the enforcers themselves, pointing out the statistical reality that the human resources field is currently 73% female.
From this foundation, he mounts a blistering critique of the entire diversity, equity, and inclusion industry.
Riker argues emphatically that DEI, despite its nomenclature, has absolutely nothing to do with genuine diversity of thought, background, or capability.
Instead, he labels the entire multi-billion-dollar DEI industry as the ultimate manifestation of demographic capture.
According to the framework laid out in the book, Modern HR departments exist primarily to enforce a new moral and psychological order across the corporate world,
In this new order, traditional, historically productive masculine traits.
such as radical honesty, unwavering confidence, blunt directness, and an aggressive drive to win market share.
Those are no longer viewed as corporate assets. Instead, they are actively treated as harmful, toxic pathologies that must be managed, suppressed, or eradicated.
Riker posits that this bureaucratic matriarchy functions quite literally as an ideological enforcement squad.
His logic dictates that when you have an administrative department responsible for hiring, firing, and setting company culture, and that department is nearly three-quarters female, the overarching values of that department will naturally, inevitably reflect female evolutionary priorities.
As we discussed with Dunbar's research, those priorities center heavily on the maintenance of social harmony, the enforcement of emotional consensus, and the extreme mitigation of physical and social risk.
Therefore, any masculine trait that inherently introduces friction, challenges the established consensus, or elevates risk in the pursuit of reward is automatically flagged by the system as toxic behavior.
It is a biological imperative masquerading as corporate policy.
The anecdotes Riker pulls to demonstrate the absurdity and the danger of this enforcement squad are striking.
He details an incident involving a veteran engineer at Boeing. During a routine safety briefing, the engineer was discussing protocol and used the phrase, "man the station."
A completely standard, universally understood aerospace and naval term that has been used for decades to mean staffing a post.
However, an internal AI algorithm designed to monitor corporate communications for inclusivity flagged the phrase.
Human Resources immediately suspended the engineer pending an investigation, officially deeming his use of the word man as a direct threat to the psychological safety of the engineering team.
He then examines IBM, detailing how the tech giant rolled out a mandatory company-wide application specifically called the microaggression tracker.
Employees were heavily encouraged, if not outright required, to constantly monitor their colleagues and log any perceived slights, awkward phrasing, or minor disagreements into the app.
Creating a permanent, gamified database of social infractions.
Even more concerning for corporate efficiency, Riker highlights a case at a major financial institution. A highly successful, high-performing male vice president was formally demoted from his leadership role.
The justification was not a failure to generate revenue or a breach of ethics. He was demoted specifically because an anonymous HR complaint was filed, stating that he spoke for 40% of the allotted time during a quarterly strategy meeting.
He was penalized for actively leading the discussion, as his dominance of the airtime was perceived as inequitable and emotionally invalidating to quieter members of the team.
Which brings us directly to one of the most vital concepts Riker introduces regarding the decay of Western capability.
The phenomenon of inverted meritocracy, which he characterizes as a systemic war on merit and excellence.
He connects the complete HR takeover of corporate culture to a total paralyzing collapse of risk-taking and innovation.
In Riker's analytical view, these massive safety bureaucracies no longer view individual competence, exceptional drive, or unparalleled excellence as assets that benefit the collective organization.
Instead, they view exceptionalism as an existential threat to group harmony.
The underlying psychology is that if one individual excels too brightly and achieves too much, it inevitably makes others in the group feel inadequate or left behind.
Because the primary directive of the matriarchal bureaucracy is to prevent anyone from feeling bad, this disruption of emotional equilibrium cannot be tolerated.
Therefore, true excellence must be systematically suppressed, handicapped, or redefined out of existence to maintain the comfort of the lowest common denominator.
He illustrates how early this conditioning begins by pointing to the script's national spelling bee.
He tells the story of a 13-year-old girl who trained relentlessly and ultimately won the grueling, highly competitive national championship.
However, instead of celebrating this peak achievement, the organizers looked at the emotional distress of the children who lost.
The very next year, they literally rewrote the foundational rules of the spelling bee to prevent sudden death eliminations,
fundamentally prioritizing the emotional comfort of the losers over the intense crucible of true competition.
But while nerfing a spelling bee is frustrating, Riker quickly pivots to show how incredibly dangerous this inverted meritocracy becomes when it impacts the real world,
where the stakes are life and death. He meticulously documents how the New York City Fire Department, under intense political pressure to meet specific gender diversity quotas mandated by the city's DEI initiatives, systematically lowered their physical fitness standards.
Specifically, they reduced the requirements for the hose drag and the wall climb by a staggering 30%.
Riker follows the data to the inevitable real-world result. Response times and operational efficiency in high-rise fire emergencies decreased.
On average, it took crews 18 seconds longer to properly deploy water on a fire.
Riker forcefully points out the brutal reality of physics. A fire can double in size every 60 seconds.
In that environment, lowering standards for the sake of diversity doesn't just hurt feelings. An 18-second delay is quite literally the difference between life and death for trapped civilians.
He provides another example from the tech sector, looking at Palantir. The company had developed a highly sophisticated, real-time crime prediction algorithm capable of significantly aiding law enforcement.
However, the project was completely canceled internally. Why?
Because a company DEI committee reviewed the software and concluded that its high-stakes urgency and focus on tracking criminal behavior harmed the community emotional wellness of the engineers working on it.
This transition from corporate inefficiency to physical danger marks a critical juncture in the book.
Riker is arguing that the maternal instinct, the deeply ingrained biological drive to protect the vulnerable and soothe distress, has mutated when applied at an institutional level.
Uncoupled from the realities of harsh environments, this instinct demands that the entire world be padded, nerfed, and sanitized to the point of catastrophic functional failure.
He refers to this overarching philosophy as the cult of caretaking.
Having established how it operates in HR and fire departments, he dedicates part 4 of the book to exploring how this cult has deeply and dangerously feminized fields where objective reality and rigorous standards were previously the only metrics that mattered.
He focuses specifically on medicine and law. His chapter exploring the medical field, which he titled Lethal Empathy, is arguably the most intense section of the text.
He doesn't just rely on anecdotes here. He starts with peer-reviewed data. He cites a comprehensive study published in JAMA Internal Medicine.
The data reveals a highly counterintuitive reality. Hospitals operating with an over 75% female nursing and administrative staff actually recorded a 28% increase in the length of patient hospital stays,
alongside significantly higher rates of patient readmission after discharge.
Riker uses this data to argue that in these highly feminized environments, the fundamental goal of the institution has shifted. As he bluntly puts it, comfort has become the metric, not cure.
The priority is no longer swift, aggressive, and effective medical intervention to eradicate the disease,
but rather managing the emotional experience of the illness, often at the expense of operational efficiency and patient outcomes.
To breathe life into the statistics from the JAMA study, Riker provides a series of harrowing medical case studies that perfectly illustrate the fatal consequences of lethal empathy.
For instance, he details a highly publicized incident in a Toronto emergency room. A patient was brought in experiencing severe, rapidly progressing anaphylactic shock,
A condition where the airway swells shut, requiring immediate, decisive action. The attending nurse recognized the symptoms.
However, hospital policy dictated that all medication administration must first be greenlit by a newly implemented internal safety app designed to prevent dosage errors.
The app was experiencing a glitch and wouldn't approve the order.
Instead of overriding the system and relying on her medical training to administer the life-saving epinephrine immediately, the nurse refused to act.
Her stated reason during the subsequent investigation was that she didn't feel comfortable making the call without the bureaucratic permission of the software.
Another tragic example he thoroughly documents involves a critical care unit where a patient suddenly coded and stopped breathing.
The standard medical protocol is immediate intubation. However, the nursing staff delayed the intubation procedure for 18 agonizing minutes.
And the reason for the delay? They were occupied consoling the patient's deeply distressed, crying daughter in the hallway.
Prioritizing emotional support for the family member over the immediate physiological crisis of the patient. The patient ultimately died due to the lack of oxygen.
Riker uses these horrific examples to argue that the female psyche, when heavily insulated by bureaucracy and unbound by rigorous outcome-based reality, transforms the practice of medicine into a theater of emotional validation.
The act of soothing feelings and adhering to safety protocols takes absolute precedence over the decisive, often messy actions required to actually save lives.
It is the ultimate, terrifying extreme of empathy taken to its illogical conclusion. From the life and death stakes of the hospital, Riker then pivots his analysis to the justice system,
A realm he provocatively labels the courtroom daycare.
In this section, he details the complete, systemic feminization of law, focusing the brunt of his critique on family courts.
The data he presents to you here is stark, quantifiable, and deeply frustrating. According to the statistics he cites, 84% of all primary child custody arrangements are awarded to mothers by default.
He breaks the data down further to show that men are 3.2 times more likely to lose custody battles, even in highly specific scenarios where the father has been the primary caregiver.
Possesses a significantly higher, more stable income, and has absolutely zero documented history of domestic abuse or neglect.
Riker utilizes this family court data to build a devastating critique of modern jurisprudence.
He argues that the legal system, much like HR and medicine, no longer rewards objective responsibility, financial stability, or demonstrable competence.
Instead, it overwhelmingly rewards the maternal archetype. The courts operate on a deeply ingrained, biased assumption that mothers are the default, natural nurturers who are inherently entitled to children.
While fathers are viewed with suspicion, treated as default threats or secondary financial providers.
He highlights how the foundational legal principle of objective evidence has been completely overridden by the prioritization of subjective emotional claims in the eyes of the law.
To prove how far objective evidence has fallen, he presents a truly dystopian case study.
He documents the story of a man in Florida who found himself in a custody dispute. His ex-wife did not file a police report against him.
She provided no medical records of abuse. There was no documented history of violence whatsoever.
Instead, she posted a video of herself crying on the social media platform TikTok, stating to her followers that she felt unsafe around her ex-husband.
The video went viral. The family court judge presiding over the case accepted the viral subjective declaration of feeling unsafe as actionable evidence and subsequently revoked the father's primary custody rights.
No proof, just a broadcasted feeling. Riker then parallels this with the environment of university Title IX tribunals, which handle accusations of sexual misconduct on campuses.
He points out that in many of these tribunals, the fundamental, centuries-old legal right to cross-examine an accuser is entirely banned.
Justified by the claim that cross-examination is re-traumatizing.
He cites a specific case at UC Davis where a male student was permanently expelled from the university.
The charge. A female student testified that she felt violated by a hug he gave her at a party.
There was no claim of groping or physical assault, merely the subjective feeling that the hug was a violation.
Once again, Riker emphasizes no objective proof of misconduct was required, just a subjective emotional state resulting in the destruction of a young man's academic future.
If we step back and synthesize the narrative, Riker is weaving across all these distinct institutions.
The newsrooms, the university faculties, corporate human resources, hospital emergency rooms, and the legal system.
We see a highly cohesive pattern. He is describing the systemic, deliberate erasure of objective standards, merit, and adversarial truth-seeking.
Replaced entirely by a mandate for emotional safety and consensus. But Riker argues that the ultimate, most devastating casualty of this macro-level shift is not just institutional efficiency.
It is male identity itself.
This realization leads directly into part 5 of the book, where he delivers a profound analysis of how boyhood is being actively pathologized.
Resulting in a massive sociological phenomenon, he terms the flight of men from society.
So we have to ask, what does this institutional capture actually mean for boys growing up in the world today?
According to Riker, the public school systems and the broader media landscape are not just passively ignoring boys. They are actively, systematically attempting to erase natural masculinity.
From the moment they enter kindergarten, boys are being psychologically conditioned to make themselves smaller, to soften their voices.
To actively avoid natural competition, and to suppress their biological instincts to roughhouse, build, and conquer.
He points to some truly devastating sociological statistics to underscore the human cost of this conditioning. Since 1999, there has been a staggering 57% rise in the rate of male suicide.
Concurrently, psychologists have noted a 200% increase in young men experiencing failure to launch syndrome.
An inability or outright refusal to leave home, enter the workforce, and assume adult responsibilities.
Riker claims our entire culture is being forced to regress into a state of eternal sanitized adolescence.
He highlights the recent media saturation of Barbiecore aesthetics as a prime example, arguing it glorifies a matriarchal, plastic world completely devoid of genuine adult consequences, historical building, or traditional masculine burden.
Riker's core argument in this section is that the modern education system has aggressively dismantled every single traditional rite of passage, physical outlet, and competitive structure that historically functioned to channel chaotic boyish energy and forge it into productive adult masculinity.
In the modern classroom, the natural male drive for competition, hierarchy, and physical dominance are not seen as raw materials to be shaped.
They are treated strictly as toxic pathologies to be medicated or punished out of existence.
The examples of this war on boyhood are ubiquitous, and Riker catalogs them meticulously.
He discusses the widespread movement across elementary schools to outright ban games like tag, dodgeball, and wrestling during recess.
The administrative justification is always that these games promote toxic masculinity, aggressive dominance, and create an environment where there are clear winners and losers, which damages the self-esteem of the losers.
He brings up a particularly infuriating case where a local Boy Scouts troop in Colorado was completely shut down by regional organizers.
The stated reason: the troops focus on traditional outdoor survival skills, like complex knot tying and building large campfires, supposedly promoted an exclusionary, hierarchical form of male bonding that did not align with modern inclusive values.
But perhaps the most perfectly distilled anecdote in the entire book involves a 10-year-old boy's science fair project.
This young boy spent weeks meticulously observing, logging, and documenting the biological reality of cannibalism in praying mantises.
He applied the rigorous scientific method and won first place.
However, the school principal intervened, forcing the boy to retract his project and surrender his blue ribbon, citing that the violent reality of the bugs caused emotional safety concerns for other students.
The principal then awarded first prize to a girl who had constructed a biologically inaccurate, glittery diorama of bees holding hands, complete with a large sign reading, "Be kind to bugs."
Riker uses that specific science fair anecdote as the perfect, crystalline encapsulation of the ideological possession that has overtaken the education system.
A young boy practicing rigorous, objective scientific observation of the natural world is punished and shamed.
Conversely, a young girl presenting a biologically false, emotionally comforting, and entirely subjective fantasy is celebrated and rewarded.
Riker's psychological analysis here is vital. When boys are told from the age of 5 that their innate natural drive to compete, to break things apart, to build structures, to discover hard truths, and to win is actually a dangerous psychological disorder, they do not magically transform into more peaceful, compliant citizens.
Instead, they become deeply nihilistic. They check out. They drop out mentally, academically, and socially.
And this profound disengagement doesn't magically resolve itself when they turn 18. It metastasizes into adulthood,
Leading to what Riker considers the most vital, actionable observation in his entire thesis: the silent exodus, or the flight of men.
This specific concept, the silent exodus, is the absolute required reading portion of the deep dive for our target audience.
Riker is highlighting a massive, silent sociological shift. Men are looking at these captured systems, the schools that punish them, the HR departments that track their microaggressions, the courts that view them as default threats.
And they are making a highly rational, calculated decision. They are retreating, they are actively opting out of the game.
He points to the macroeconomic data. The male labor force participation rate has plummeted to historic lows. Union membership among working-class men has dropped by nearly 40%.
Riker explains this drop by noting that modern unions largely stopped fighting for tangible, masculine concerns like higher wages and physical workplace safety, and instead transformed into political entities fighting for pronoun compliance and DEI initiatives.
Men are simply rejecting these virtue signaling systems because they recognize that the system is designed to actively punish their innate competence and extract their labor without offering respect or authority in return.
To put a human face on this macroeconomic trend, Riker provides the fascinating case study of a senior, highly compensated engineer at a Fortune 500 tech company.
This engineer was reviewing the code for a new, internally mandated DEI application and discovered a massive, critical flaw in the data encryption that would have exposed employee records.
Because he operated like a traditional male engineer, pointing out the flaw directly, bluntly, and urgently to management without padding his language with empathy statements, he was immediately reported to human resources for aggressive and uncollaborative communication.
Instead of apologizing, attending sensitivity training, or fighting the HR bureaucracy, the engineer simply walked away.
He deleted his LinkedIn profile, quit his lucrative job, and used his savings to move to an off-grid cabin in Montana.
Riker views this story not as an isolated, quirky incident, but as the bleeding edge of a massive macro trend.
Competent men are quietly building parallel systems, investing in off-grid communities, and seeking self-employment.
They're systematically retreating from a corporate and social matrix that demands their complete emotional submission as the price of admission.
He also points to broader cultural indicators that confirm this massive shift. He looks at the sudden massive surge in the tradwife trend across social media platforms.
Alongside a documented 200% spike in the sales of male survivalist gear, homesteading equipment, and rural land purchases.
Riker interprets these data points as a full-scale, grassroots rejection of feminist economics and the bureaucratic matriarchy.
Men are actively creating their own physical and social exclusion zones, spaces where rugged competence is still highly valued, where objective reality still dictates survival, and where they no longer have to apologize for their fundamental biology.
And this realization naturally propels us into the sixth and final section of Riker's extensive book.
Having spent hundreds of pages diagnosing the pathology of institutional capture, he finally transitions from diagnosis to prescription.
The lingering question is, how does a society actually restore the balance? What is the tangible, actionable blueprint for pushing back against the GSR network and the DEI bureaucracy?
For Riker, the ultimate proven model is not a theory. It is found in the current geopolitical actions of Hungary.
Yes, Riker dedicates the climax of his book to heavily praising Hungary's recent, highly controversial political and social policies.
He essentially views Hungary as the one nation that looks squarely at the failing maternal state of the modern West, recognized the terminal decline it caused, and successfully possessed the political will to say no.
Riker doesn't just offer ideological praise. He unpacks the specific economic and demographic data emerging from Hungary to substantiate his claim that actively rejecting these feminized bureaucratic systems leads directly to national flourishing.
He details the specific mechanics of the Hungarian pushback. The government took decisive, hardline action. They actively and legally abolished all gender studies programs at the university level, declaring them scientifically invalid and socially destructive.
Furthermore, they purged the civil service, systematically firing millions of dollars worth of DEI consultants and administrative bloat.
Concurrently, they completely restructured their tax code to provide massive, life-altering financial incentives for traditional motherhood and family formation, rather than subsidizing corporate careerism for women.
The results, according to the data Riker presents, were immediate and profound. Hungary experienced a robust 4.1% economic growth rate.
And a stunning 18% jump in national birth rates. A demographic miracle in a Europe otherwise experiencing terminal population collapse.
The cultural actions they took were just as aggressive as the economic ones.
Riker details how the Hungarian government literally banned the use of gender-neutral language and progressive linguistic framing in all public broadcasting and state media.
They forcefully expelled numerous international Soros-funded NGOs from operating within their public school systems, organizations that Riker claims were the primary vectors pushing the emotional daycare agenda onto children.
The result of purging this ideology and bringing back highly structured, rigorous adversarial teaching methods. Riker cites a remarkable 22% jump in the overall academic performance of boys nationwide in just 3 years.
Riker uses this data to boldly declare that Hungary has empirically proven his thesis. When a society stops treating its young boys like defective, overly aggressive girls that need to be medicated, and instead embraces their natural competitive drive, they don't just survive, they absolutely thrive.
In Riker's epilogue, his final message to the reader transcends political policy, becomes a direct, highly personal call to arms.
He states unequivocally that these vital Western institutions, academia, law, medicine, media, and the corporate sector, can be reclaimed from the bureaucratic matriarchy.
However, it requires a massive coordinated shift in male behavior. It requires men to instantly and permanently stop self-censoring in the workplace and the classroom.
It requires men to categorically refuse to apologize for being physically strong, highly competent, relentlessly logical, and brutally honest.
Riker's ultimate conclusion hinges on a simple operational reality. The entire emotional daycare system fundamentally relies on male compliance and male labor to function.
He argues that the very moment highly competent men collectively refuse to participate in the charade, the moment they stop bowing to the GSR tactics of HR departments, the bureaucratic matriarchy, devoid of the competence required to sustain a civilization, will simply collapse under its own weight.
It is a profoundly fiery, unapologetic conclusion to a book that absolutely refuses to back down from its core premise for a single page. Okay.
Right.
To attempt to wrap up this incredibly deep, expansive dive.
To synthesize Riker's massive thesis as neutrally and accurately as possible, the Great Feminization posits that the Western world is currently in the late stages of a profound existential clash of fundamental human values.
Riker meticulously traces how a silent but overwhelming demographic shift in institutional power has fundamentally altered the core operating system of modern society.
He makes the detailed case that foundational institutions originally built upon adversarial, truth-seeking, rigorous logic, and brutal, merit-based competition have been thoroughly captured.
They are now controlled by a female-coded value system that prioritizes emotional safety, group consensus, and the absolute reduction of perceived harm above all other metrics, including efficiency and truth.
Regardless of whether you passionately agree with his conclusions or find his assertions deeply objectionable, his granular mapping of exactly how modern HR departments, universities, and media conglomerates operate through indirect social enforcement and linguistic control provides a highly detailed, invaluable lens through which to analyze our contemporary cultural conflicts.
Absolutely. The framework he provides is impossible to unsee once you understand it. And as we prepare to leave you today, we want to give you one final, highly provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds directly on Riker's source material, but looks just over the horizon to the very near future.
It's a critical question.
If our current human institutions, from corporate HR departments to the ivy-covered walls of academia, are currently enforcing these strict gossip grid linguistic rules, mandating tone policing, and elevating emotional safety standards above objective reality, what exactly happens when our next generation artificial intelligence models are trained on this exact repository of corporate and academic data?
Will the superintelligent AI of the future permanently hard-code this emotional totalitarianism into the very architecture of our technology?
Will we face a future where these hyper-feminized norms of consensus and safety are algorithmically enforced at the speed of light long after the human HR administrators are gone?
It's something to seriously, deeply think about as we build the next era of human capability.
That is a deeply fascinating and, depending on your perspective, a somewhat terrifying extrapolation of his thesis.
Truly.
Well, that is unfortunately all the time we have for today's massive exploration. Please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive so we can continue bringing you these exhaustive, in-depth breakdowns of the culture's most important texts.
And one last time, if you found yourself fascinated, outraged, red-pilled, or simply deeply intrigued by the sociological mechanics we unpack today, you absolutely need to buy the full ebook.
Head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to pick up your copy. And make sure you don't forget to follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest essays and writings.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
And thank you, as always, for diving deep.